We start Antony from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. This might be 10 programs. The grandfather of Antony was the famous pleader whom Marius put to death for having taken part with Sulla. His father was Antony, surnamed of Creta. Not very famous, are distinguished in public life, but a worthy good man. Better to be the latter than the former, right? And particularly remarkable for his liberality, as may appear from a single example. He was not very rich, and was, for that reason, checked in the exercise of his good nature by his wife, a friend that stood in need of money came to borrow of him. Money he had none, but he bade a servant bring him water in a silver basin, with which, when it was brought, he wetted his face as if he meant to shave, and sending away the servant upon another errand, gave his friend the basin, desiring him to turn it to his purpose. And when there was afterwards a great inquiry for it in the house, and his wife was in a very ill humor, and was going to put the servants one by one to the search, he acknowledged what he had done, and begged her pardon. His wife was Julia, of the family of the Khazars, who, for her discretion and fair behavior, was not inferior to any of her time. Under her, Antony received his education, she being, after the death of his father, remarried to Cornelius Lentulus, who was put to death by Cicero for having been of Catiline's conspiracy. This probably was the first ground and occasion of that mortal grudge that Antony bore Cicero. He says even that the body of Lentulus was denied burial till, by application made to Cicero's wife, it was granted to Julia. But this seems to be a manifest error, for none of those that suffered in the consulate of Cicero had the right of burial denied them. Antony grew up a very beautiful youth, but by the worst of misfortunes, he fell into the acquaintance and friendship of Curio, a man abandoned to his pleasures, who, to make Antony's dependence upon him a matter of great necessity, plunged him into a life of drinking and dissipation, and led him through a course of such extravagance that he ran, at that early age, into debt to the amount of 250 talents. For this sum Curio became his surety, on hearing which the elder Curio, his father, drove Antony out of his house. After this, for some short time, he took part with Claudius, the most insolent and outrageous demagogue of the time, in his course of violence and disorder, but getting weary before long of his madness, and apprehensive of the powerful party forming against him, he had left Italy and traveled to Greece, where he spent his time in military exercises and the study of eloquence. He took most to what was called Asiatic taste in speaking, which was then at its height, and was, in many ways, suitable to his ostentatious, vaunting temper, full of empty flourishes and unsteady efforts for glory. After some stay in Greece, he was invited by Gabinius, who had been consul, to make a campaign with him in Syria, which at first he refused, not being willing to serve in a private character, but receiving a commission to command the horse, he went along with him. His first service was against Aristobulus, who had prevailed with the Jews to rebel. Here he was himself the first man to scale the largest of the works and beat Aristobulus out of all of them, after which he routed in a pitched battle an army many times over the number of his, killed almost all of them, and took Aristobulus and his own sons prisoner. Not the plural. So what was his Hebrew name? This war ended. Gabinius was solicited by Ptolemy to restore him to his kingdom of Egypt at a promise made of 10,000 talents reward. Most of the officers were against this enterprise, and Gabinius himself did not much like it. Though sorely tempted by the 10,000 talents, but Antony, desirous of brave actions and willing to please Ptolemy, joined in persuading Gabinius to go. And whereas all were of opinion that the most dangerous thing before them was the march to Pelusium, in which they would have to pass over a deep sand where no fresh water was to be hoped for, along the Acroregma, along the Acroregma and the Cerebonian marsh, which the Egyptians call Typhon's breathing hole, using the Greek term Typhon, but I don't know which the Greek spelling, but and which is, in probability, water left behind by or making its way through from the Red Sea, which is here derived from the Mediterranean by a narrow isthmus, Antony being ordered thither with the horse. Not only made himself master of the passes, but won Pelusium itself, a great city, took the garrison prisoners, and by this means rendered the marsh secure to the army, and the way to victory not difficult for the general to pursue. The enemy also reaped some benefit of his eagerness for honor, for when Ptolemy, after he had entered Pelusium in his rage and spite against the Egyptians, designed to put them to the sword, Antony withstood him and hindered the execution. In all the great and frequent skirmishes and battles, he gave continual proofs of his personal valor and military conduct, and once in particular, by wheeling about and attacking the rear of the enemy, he gave the victory to the assailants in the front, and received for this service signal marks of distinction. Nor was his humanity towards the deceased Archelaus less taken notice of. He had been formerly his guest and acquaintance, and as he was now compelled, he fought him bravely while alive, but on his death sought out his body and buried it with royal honors. The consequence was that he left behind him a great name among the Alexandrians, and all who were serving in the Roman army looked upon him as a most gallant soldier. Well, going back to the river, one of the things we find about that is that, the marsh, some of it's just mythological attachment, an entity is local or universal, or that quality is local or universal, and they connect it to that place. Sometimes there's literally an experience. They say this place or the other. Oh, I don't remember what the Egyptian equivalent of Typhon is. Just like they didn't call it was yes, you're not Osiris, and Tahota instead of Thoth, and yeah, you're never going to find some of the mythological and other names looking for it from one language to the next, unless you actually have learned the connection. Just like you're not going to find a James or a John or a Jesus if you went back and looked for Jesus and his disciples, and no Josiahs, no Joshuas, no, He had also a very good and noble appearance. His beard was well grown, his forehead large, and his nose aquiline, giving him altogether a bold, masculine look that reminded people of the faces of Hercules in paintings and sculptures. It was, moreover, an ancient tradition that Antony's were descended from Hercules by a son of his called Anton, and this opinion he thought to give credit to by the similarity of his person just mentioned, and also by the fashion of his dress. Now, there can be truth of that, and just because the Jews tend to not be of Semitic ancestry, yet they claim to be very strict about that thing, maybe at some point in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, one community or another did that. But there is some truth to some of these lineage claims. Rumbling the tumbler here. For whenever he had to appear before large numbers, he wore his tunic girt low about the hips, a broadsword on his side, and over all a large coarse mantle. What might seem to some very insupportable, his vaunting, his raillery, his drinking in public, sitting down by the men as they were taking their food and eating, as he stood off the common soldiers' tables, made him the delight and pleasure of the army. In love affairs also he was very agreeable. He gained many friends by the assistance he gave them in theirs, and took other people's raillery upon his own with good humor, and his generous ways. His open and lavish hand in gifts and favors to his friends and fellow soldiers did a great deal for him in his first advance to power, and after he had become great, long maintained his fortunes, when 1,000 follies were hastening their overthrow. One instance of his liberality I must relate. Because back then they were using words like liberal and stuff. Right. There's liberality and there's liberal, which are not quite the same thing, because a libertine can be, if I want to do this or believe this, I do, and, so certain fun. But anyways, it's not these are liberals and conservatives, so here's the list that they're supposed to believe. No, that's not how that works. But anyways, I must relate. He had ordered payment to one of his friends of 25 myriads of money, or tikis, as the Romans call it, and his steward, wondering at the extravagance of the sum, laid all the silver in a heap as he should pass by. Antony, seeing the heap, asked what it meant. His steward replied, "The money you have ordered to be given to your friend." So perceiving the man's malice, said he, "I thought that the Decies had been much more. 'Tis too late, let it be doubled. This, however, was at a latter time, when the Roman state finally broke up into two hostile factions, the aristocratical party joining Pompey, who was in the city, and the popular side seeking help from Caesar, who was at the head of an army in Gaul. Curio, the friend of Antony, having changed his party and devoted himself to Caesar, brought over Antony also to his service, and the influence which he gained with the people by his eloquence and by the money which was supplied by Caesar enabled him to make Antony first tribune of the people and then augur. And Antony's accession to office was at once of the greatest advantage to Caesar. C is K and A-E, but in Greek you'd have I, and S-A-R is not, there's no sound. It's sar, not czar, sar, In the first place, he resisted the consul, Archelaus, who was putting under Pompey's orders the troops who were already collected, and was giving him power to raise new levies. He, on the other hand, making an order that they should be sent unto Syria to reinforce Bibulus, who was making war with the Parthians, and that no one should give in his name to serve under Pompey. Next, when the senators would not suffer Caesar's letters to be received or read in the Senate, by virtue of his office, he read them publicly, and succeeded so well that many were brought to change their mind. Caesar's demands, as they appeared in what he wrote, being but just and reasonable, at length two questions being put in the Senate, the one whether Pompey should dismiss his army, the other if Caesar his, some were for the former, for the latter all, except some few, when Antony stood up and put the question, if it would be agreeable to them that both Pompey and Caesar should dismiss their armies. This proposal met with the greatest approval, but they gave him loud acclamations and called for it to be put to the vote. But when the consuls would not have it so, Caesar's friends again made some few offers, very fair and equitable, but were strongly opposed by Cato, and Antony himself was commanded to leave the Senate by the consul Lentulus. So leaving them with execrations, and disguising himself in a servant's dress, hiring a carriage with Quintus Cassius, he went straight away to Caesar, declaring at once, when they reached the camp, that affairs at Rome were conducted without any order or justice, that the privilege of speaking in the Senate was denied the tribunes, and that he who spoke for common fair dealing was driven out and in danger of his life. Upon this, Caesar sent his army in motion and marched into Italy. Itala. Okay, yeah. For this reason, it is that Cicero writes in his Philippes that Antony was as much the cause of the civil war as Helen was of the Trojan, but this is but a calumny, for Caesar was not of so slight or weak a temper as to suffer himself to be carried away by the indignation of the moment into a civil war with his country upon the sight of Antony and Cassius seeking refuge in his camp, meanly dressed, and in a hired carriage, without ever having thought of it or taken any such resolution long before. This was to him who wanted a pretense of declaring war a fair and plausible occasion. But the true motive that led him was the same that formerly led Alexander and Carus against all mankind, the unquenchable thirst of empire. and the distracted ambition of being the greatest man in the world, which was impracticable for him unless Pompey were put down. So soon, then, as he had advanced and occupied Rome and driven Pompey out of Italy, he proposed first to go against the legions that Pompey had in Spain, and then cross over and follow him with the fleet that should be prepared during his absence. In the meantime, leaving the government of Rome to Lepidus as praetor, and the command of the troops, and of Italy to Antony as tribune of the people, Antony was not long in getting the hearts of the soldiers, joining with them in their exercises, and for the most part living amongst them and making them presents to the utmost of his abilities. But with all others, he was unpopular enough. He was too lazy to pay attention to the complaints of persons who were injured. He listened impatiently to petitions, and he had an ill name for familiarity with other people's wives. In short, the government of Caesar, which, so far as he was concerned himself, had the appearance of anything rather than a tyranny, got a bad repute through his friends, and of these friends, Antony, as he had the largest trust and committed the greatest errors, was thought the most deeply in fault. Caesar, however, at his return from Spain, overlooked the charges against him, and had no reason ever to complain, in the employments he gave him in the war, of any want of courage, energy, or military skill. He himself, going aboard at Brundusium, sailed over the Ionian Sea with a few troops, and sent back the vessels with orders to Antony and Gabinius to embark the army and come over with all speed to Macedonia, Gabinius having on his mind to put to sea in the rough, dangerous weather of the winter season, was for marching the army round by the long-hand route, but Antony, being more afraid lest Caesar might suffer the number of his enemies, who pressed him hard and beat back Lipo, who was watching with a fleet at the mouth of the haven of Brundusium, by attacking his galley with a number of small boats, and gaining thus an opportunity to put on board 20,000 foot and 800 horse, and so set out to sea. And being espied by the enemy and pursued from this danger, he was rescued by a strong south wind, which sprang up and raised so high a sea that the enemy's galleys could make little way, but his own ships were driving before it upon a lee shore of cliffs and rocks running sheer to the water, where there was no hope of escape, when all of a sudden the wind turned about to southwest and blew from the land to the main sea, where Antony, now sailing in security, saw the coast all covered with the wreck of the enemy's fleet, for hither the galleys in pursuit had been carried by the gale, and not a few of them dashed to pieces. Many men and much property fell into Antony's hands. He took also the town of Lysis, and by the seasonable arrival of so large a reinforcement gave Caesar great encouragement. There was not one of the many engagements that now took place one after another in which he did not signalize himself. Twice he stopped the army in its full flight, led them back to a charge, and gained the victory, so that now, without reason, his reputation, next to Caesar's, was greatest in the army. And what opinion Caesar himself had him well appeared. When for the final battle in Pharsalia, which was to determine everything, he himself chose to lead the right wing. Right wing, left wing of the army, not what we mean nowadays by the phrase, in any sense really, committing the charge of the left to Antony as to the best officer of all that served under him. After the battle, Caesar being created dictator, went in pursuit of Pompey and sent Antony to Rome with the character of master of the horse, who is in office and power next to the dictator. When present and in his absence, the first, and pretty nearly indeed the sole magistrate, for on the appointment of a dictator, with the one exception of the tribunes, all other magistrates ceased to exercise any authority in Rome. And furthest, if you're talking about political types, not this nonsense where they just arbitrarily decide that left and right is these parties. Furthest left, it doesn't matter whether you have one or a corporation or communist or fascist. That most totalitarian is most left. Anarchist is most right. You have in between, you have the socialist. You have the republic, the constitutional republic, democracy in the center, constitutional democracy a little bit to the right. That's actually a form of government that I favor. America's never been any sort of democracy. But it's a constitutional republic. Political parties in the government always tend to be a little bit, left at that, at least republic or socialist. But then you have libertine further to the right. And then you have the gangs. Gangs and other sorts of mob rule. And then you have true anarchy, which almost never exists. Dolabella, however, who was tribune, being a young man and eager for change, was now bringing in a general measure for cancelling debts, and wanted Antony, who was his friend and forward enough to promote any popular project, to take part with him in this step. Asinius and Trebellius were of the contrary opinion, and it so happened at the same time Antony was crossed by a terrible suspicion that Dolabella was too familiar with his wife, and in great trouble at this, he parted with her, she being his cousin and daughter to Caius Antonius, colleague of Cicero, and taking part with Asinius, came to open hostilities with Dolabella, who had seized on the forum, intending to pass his law by force. Well, if you don't know, don't make accusations, but it would be better to curtail opportunities, you could say, because the little things add up and end up with the great things, right? Antony, backed by a vote of the Senate that Dolabella should be put down by force of arms, went down and attacked him, killing some of his and losing some of his own men, and by this action lost his favor with the commonalty. Yeah, don't just use your political power for your own personal interest, but let's be real. All politicians operate their beliefs and act in office and their own agendas, but you know what I mean by that, Well, with the better class, and with all well-conducted people, his general course of life made him, as Cicero says, absolutely odious, utter disgust being excited by his drinking bouts at all hours, his wild expenses, his gross amours. Well, why is his amours gross and not the other people's? But the day spent in sleeping or walking off his debauches, and the nights in banqueting and at theaters, and in celebrating the nuptials of some comedian or buffoon. It is related that, drinking all night at the wedding of Hippias, the comedian, on the morning, having to harangue the people, he came forward overcharged as he was, and vomited before them all, one of his friends holding his gown for him. Sergius, the player, who was one of the friends who could do most with him. Also, Ctheris, a woman of the same trade, whom he made much of, and who, when he went his progress, accompanied him in a litter, and had her equipage, not in anything inferior to his mother's, while every one, moreover, was scandalized at the sight of the golden cups that he took with him, fitter for the ornaments of a procession than the uses of a journey, at his having pavilions set up, and sumptuous morning repasts laid out by the river sides and in groves, at his having chariots drawn by lions and common women and singing girls quartered upon the houses of serious fathers and mothers of families, and it seemed very unreasonable that Caesar out of Italy should lodge in the open field, and with great fatigue and danger pursue the remainder of a hazardous war, whilst others, by favor of his authority, should insult the citizens with their impudent luxury. All this appears to have aggravated party quarrels in Rome, and to have encouraged the soldiers in acts of license and rapacity. And accordingly, when Caesar came home, he acquitted Dolabella, and being created the third time consul, took not Antony, but Lepidus for his colleague. Pompey's house being offered for sale, Antony bought it, and with the price was demanded of him, loudly complained. This he tells himself, and because he thought his former services had not been recompensed as they deserved, made him not follow Caesar with the army into Libya. However, Caesar, by dealing gently with his errors, seems to have succeeded in curing him of a good deal of his folly and extravagance. He gave up his former courses and took a wife, Fulvia, the widow of Claudius, the demagogue, a woman not born for spinning or housewifery, nor one that could be content with ruling a private husband, but prepared to govern a first magistrate, or give orders to a commander-in-chief.